Do you know what it feels like when the person you've trusted your whole life betrays you and laughs in your face? It's not pain. It's not even resentment. It's a burning mixture of hatred and contempt. When I found out the child I gave everything to wasn't mine, my world turned upside down. This woman, was worse than any lie I could imagine. But I wasn't going to scream. No. I was going to destroy her quietly. Strip her of everything she took for granted. Money, comfort, security. I'm going to make her on her knees begging me to give back even a crumb of what she's lost. What will you do when your life is crumbling before your eyes? Will you fight or will you accept your fate? What if the person who is destroying your life is the one you loved the most?
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
These were the thoughts that had been on my mind for the past few weeks. My life, which had recently seemed normal, if not routine, was suddenly starting to come apart at the seams. Yesterday was the last straw. I learnt the truth, and that truth changed me forever. Alla, my wife, the woman I had once dreamed of a future with, had betrayed me in the most vile way. She didn't just cheat on me, she gave me someone else's child and made me believe that I was the father. For 3 years I lived a lie, deceiving myself, trusting her and working endlessly to support her and the baby. I was a blind idiot. This morning was strange. I looked at Alla sitting by the window in an old dressing gown, her hair a mess, her face pale and haggard. She no longer resembled the well-groomed and attractive woman who had won me over a few years ago. Lately, her life had centered around her phone and social media, where she flirted with her lover while I toiled at work trying to earn money for our house. Now, knowing the truth, I felt nothing but cold disgust for her. But it wasn't over. No, her downfall was just beginning. She had no idea I knew. Her phone last night, left unattended on the couch, was the key to exposing her double life. I stared at the screen for a long time, at the pop-up messages from her friend, and internally simmered. Now, realizing everything that was going on behind my back, the only thing I felt was cold, merciless rage. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to talk to her. I had another plan. One that she would never recover from. Our relationship wasn't always like this. When we met, Alla was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She was active, full of life, always up for something new. We laughed a lot, made plans for the future. I loved her so much that I was willing to do anything to make her happy. We got married and everything seemed perfect. I worked hard to provide for both of us, and then the baby came. The baby became the center of our world. I was happy despite the fatigue and the constant responsibilities. But every day I began to notice how Alla was changing. She stopped being interested in the house, didn't cook, didn't clean. She spent more and more time on her phone, withdrew into herself. At first I tried to put it down to postpartum depression, fatigue. I told myself it would pass, that we just needed time. But it wouldn't go away. It got worse every day. Alla started to get irritated at every little thing. I'd come home from work, exhausted and tired, and at home I'd find dirt, shouting and complete indifference. She didn't even bother to talk, just threw irritated glances and went into the other room with her phone in her hands. It became our new norm. I put up with it. I put up with it until yesterday. Alla's phone turned out to be my key to the truth. That night, when she went to bed, I accidentally saw a message on the screen. Not on purpose, it just popped up. "Miss you," it said. At that moment, something in my chest shivered. I picked up her phone, my heart beating at a frantic pace, and started scrolling through the messages. There was another man she was flirting with and then openly texting. I read their conversations where they discussed meeting, where he asked about our baby. She would answer him that their baby would start talking soon. I froze. Inside everything was screaming, but on the outside I was calm. I was slowly realizing that this baby was not mine. Alla wasn't just cheating on me. She had fathered a child, and like the last fool I had been feeding someone else's child for 3 years, thinking it was my child. I couldn't believe it. First there was denial, then there was anger. I wanted to storm into the bedroom, wake her up and scream the truth in her face. But no. I should have been smarter than that. I decided to make her realize she'd lost everything she once had. I didn't just want to punish her, I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. I've often heard stories of men leaving their wives for cheating. There are some who forgive. But what do you do when you realize that your entire existence for the past few years has been a sham? That every penny, every hour of your work was not for the good of your family, but to provide for someone else's child, which you were slipped as yours. I couldn't forgive or forget. I'm not the kind of person who would swallow this humiliation in silence. Every day when I came home, I looked at her and I couldn't get rid of one question: why did she do it? After all, we had everything. We weren't rich, but we had stability. We loved each other, made plans, talked about the future. When she got pregnant, I was ready to do anything to make sure that this child didn't need anything. I worked from morning till night, saved money, planned for the future. And this is what I got in return. Her cheating wasn't just betrayal. It was the destruction of everything I thought was mine. Every day, I turned my mind back to the moments when she'd seemed to be honest with me. But now I realized it was a lie. Even her eyes, which used to look at me with love, were now empty, cold. And I realized that my life with her was over, even before I knew the truth. But I didn't want to just walk away. Oh no. Leaving would be too easy. She might even have breathed a sigh of relief. I was going to make her pay for everything. To make her realize every mistake she'd made. It wasn't just going to be punishment. It was going to be real, insidious revenge. When you live with someone for years, you know their weaknesses. You know what makes him happy and what can destroy his world. Alla, my wife, was addicted to comfort. She liked to feel provided for. She liked that she could worry about nothing while I was hard at work. So I decided that's where I'd start. She took my money for granted. She thought it would just flow to her like a rolling stone. That I'd carry her and this baby for the rest of my life. But she was wrong. I'm gonna stop giving her money, take everything she's taken as her own. Let her try to survive without me. Let her see what real life is like. At first I thought I'd do it quickly. I'd just walk away, leave her with the baby, let her deal with it on her own. But no. That would have been too easy. I wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to feel her world falling apart every second. Day by day, step by step, I would take away everything she took for granted. I didn't want to just end the relationship. No, I wanted her world to crack at the seams as she realized that her life was nothing without me. The next morning I got up earlier than usual, but I didn't wake Alla up. Let her think it was business as usual. I showered, made myself a coffee and sat in the kitchen, thinking about how to put my plan into action. She was going to lose everything. She was used to living off me, used to me paying all the bills, buying everything she needed. Alla had never worked, never planned to work. Now she would see what it was like to be without support. After work, I stopped by the lawyer's office. We drew up the property division papers. I kept the house, as well as everything I'd bought with my money. Her stuff, old rags, cosmetics and a phone, that's all she'd get. I warned her I was going to file for divorce and demand a paternity test. After that, nothing awaits her but the streets. When I got home, Alla was sitting with her phone in her hands as usual, unaware that her world was about to fall apart. I walked into the house, trying to keep a calm expression on my face. Alla didn't even pay attention to me, engrossed in another endless feed on her phone. Our house, which had once been a place of comfort and tranquility, now looked like a ruin. There were things lying everywhere, kids' toys scattered on the floor, dirty dishes in the kitchen. But I didn't care about that anymore. There was revenge ahead. The first step was simple. I stopped giving money for household needs. She always asked for it, and I gave it to her. Automatically, no questions asked. I just took out my wallet and gave it, knowing that the money would be used to buy food, clothes for the baby, some little things for the house. But when you find out that your money is not only going towards the family, but also towards your wife's lovemaking with another man, it becomes impossible. The day she approached me with another request, I simply said, "I don't have any money." She didn't even believe it at first. I saw her face petrified, and maybe she thought it was a joke. "What do you mean you don't have any money?" she asked, raising her head sharply from the phone. "It means I can't give you any more money. Times are tough." Alla hummed, flicking her hair back as if it didn't bother her at all. "It won't be for long, will it?" I could hear the irritation in her voice. "Did you lose your job or something?" "I just can't take it anymore," I repeated, looking straight into her eyes. She should have realized that this wasn't a plea for help or an explanation. It was a fact. At that moment, I felt the control begin to shift to me. Her face contorted, but she didn't say anything. Of course, she was hoping I would change my mind. But no. This was just the first step in her downfall. Week after week, the situation escalated. At first she didn't notice that she was actually running out of money, then she started asking more and more often. Her irritation grew every day. She became more aggressive in conversation, even on the rare occasions we crossed paths in the house. She would yell at me for any little thing, for not doing the dishes, for not having her favorite foods in the fridge. I just kept quiet. Let her yell. Let her snap. But her patience was wearing thin. One evening when I came home after work, I found her in full hysterics. She rushed over to me, waving her phone at me with messages popping up on the screen. "What does this mean?" she shouted, pointing her finger at the screen. I looked at her calmly, not reacting to her hysterics. "You won't give me any more money?" she shouted, unable to contain her rage any longer. "What the hell is this? How am I supposed to live? What am I going to buy for the baby?" I took a step back, crossing my arms over my chest. Now it was my turn to speak. "This is your problem, Allah. You've been living off me for 3 years. That's enough." Her face turned pale. She didn't seem to have expected such a move. First I saw surprise, then anger, but underneath it all was something else: panic. I could see that panic growing in her eyes as she realized that she could no longer live as she had before, that her familiar life was shattered. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I made myself a cup of coffee and watched her. She looked as if the world didn't touch her at all. Sloppily gathered hair, crumpled t-shirt, the same dressing gown she wore for days on end. Yesterday it had only irritated me, but today it was grimly satisfying. She would lose everything. But so far, she didn't suspect a thing. I decided to start small. An ordinary conversation that would seem harmless, but was in fact the first step to the collapse of her life. "Allah," I began calmly, taking a sip of coffee. "We need to talk." She looked up at me, her eyes full of fatigue and irritation. Perhaps she was expecting another complaint about the dirty house or the fact that she hadn't cooked dinner again. But that didn't matter tonight. Things went much deeper than that. "About what?" she asked indifferently, not looking away from the phone. "About us," I paused, choosing my words carefully. "And about the future." Allah hummed, but put the phone aside. "What did you have in mind again?" Her voice was soaked with indifference. "Have you ever thought about changing things?" I continued, watching her reaction carefully. "You haven't worked for a long time, the house isn't in order, I'm always at work. Don't you think it's time you took responsibility for your life?" She frowned, clearly not expecting such a topic of conversation. "I'm on maternity leave," she said, as if that was supposed to be the universal excuse for everything. "And what do you suggest? Where would I go with a baby?" "The baby's big enough." I tried not to give myself away. "You could at least get a part-time job. I don't have to do all the work. We're a family, aren't we?" Allah hesitated, not knowing how to answer. There was a look of surprise on her face, mixed with a little fear. She'd always thought that I would provide for her forever, that my role was to be the relentless breadwinner. But now her confidence was beginning to fade. "Come on," she tried to laugh, but it was clumsy. "You said you were fine. And what makes you think I have to work all of a sudden? We had an agreement." "We had an agreement when I thought it was my baby," I cut her off abruptly. Her face went pale, and she froze in place. That was the phrase that changed everything. I saw her stiffen in an instant. Her eyes widened with horror, and she swallowed nervously. "What are you? What do you mean?" She finally squeezed out, trying to keep her composure. I stepped forward, looking her straight in the eye, and said each word with icy clarity. "I know that child is not mine. And I know who you've been seeing all this time. Everything you've been building up, all your lies, now it's over." Allah turned even paler, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but no words came out. This was the moment I'd been waiting for a long time. She realized that her world had collapsed and now she would have to face reality. "Ivan, it's not true," she started, but I didn't let her finish. "You don't even have to try to make excuses," I interrupted her. "I've seen all your correspondence. I know everything. There's no point in lying anymore." Allah was silent, her eyes darting around the room like a hunted animal. I could see the fear and despair slowly filling her mind. She realized that her world, built on lies and betrayal, was beginning to crumble. What? What are you going to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. I stood up and walked over to her, looking down at her. I'm going to make you lose everything, I said with cold calmness. The house, the money, the comfortable life. You're not going to live off me anymore. You're going to be left with what you deserve. Alla jumped up, clearly realizing I wasn't kidding. Ivan, please. She rose from her chair, her voice filled with panic. You can't just throw us out on the street. I can, I answered without a shadow of emotion. And I'm going to do it. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in shock. I left Alla in the kitchen in utter confusion. Her world was beginning to crumble, and she hadn't yet fully realized the gravity of her situation. But I didn't care. The anger that had long been building up inside now felt like an icy wall between us. I was sure of my every action. Alla didn't immediately rush after me, but a few minutes later, when I was already in the bedroom, she burst in, her face twisted with fear and panic. Ivan, we can talk about this. She shouted, grabbing my arm. You don't understand. This isn't what you think it is. I pulled away from her, restraining myself from exploding. Discuss? You want me to discuss with you how you've been lying to my face all day? Do you really think I'm going to talk to you after what I found out? I made a mistake. Her voice was shaking, she was almost crying. But I love you, Love me? I grinned coldly. Do you love me so much that you gave birth to another man? Or love me so much that you lived with him behind my back for 3 years, taking advantage of my kindness? No, Alla. You don't love me. You only love yourself. I've done everything for you, I continued, taking a step closer to her. I worked my ass off to make sure you had everything you wanted, while you were seeing someone else. You betrayed me, Alla. And now you're going to get what you deserve. I didn't yell. I spoke calmly, with restraint. But every word I said was like a knife in her heart. She knew she had lost everything. You can't do this, Ivan, she whispered, standing in front of me in complete shock. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you have to leave us. Wrong? I grinned, feeling the cold rage surge over me. You weren't just wrong. You built your life on me, knowing it was all a lie. Now you're going to have to learn to live your life differently. She wrapped her arms around her head. She didn't seem to know what to say. Her tears now made me feel nothing but contempt. I'm the mother of your child. She shouted, as if that would make a difference. I gave her a look of cold contempt. You are the mother, but not of my child, I said. And don't you dare use that as an argument anymore. I don't owe you anything anymore. Neither you nor your baby. Alla sat down on the bed, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs. But her tears no longer touched me. For the first time in a long time, I felt relieved that I was finally free of this lie. What will happen now? She whispered through her tears, not looking up at me. I stood at the door with my arms folded across my chest, looking down at her. It's the way it has to be now, I said. I'm going to file for divorce. And you're going to have to leave. You're used to living on my money, but that comfort is over. You'll go to work, you'll finally realize what real life is. You're gonna have to take care of yourself and your baby. I'm not your support anymore. Alla looked up at me with eyes full of horror. Where am I going to go? She whispered. I have no one. I shrugged my shoulders. That's not my problem anymore, I replied. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. I left the room, leaving her to sit in silence. My heart no longer ached. I felt only satisfaction that I had finally taken my life in my hands. She had lost everything she had and could no longer count on me. I walked to the door, feeling a sense of satisfaction ignite inside me. Finally, after months of humiliation, I felt in control of my life. And this was only the beginning of the end. Pack your things, Alla. You have 2 days to get out of here, I tossed over my shoulder. And don't come back. She didn't answer. She sat in complete silence, realizing that her world had collapsed completely. Alla remained standing there, as if petrified. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes widened with horror, but she remained silent. I stared at her, expecting her to explode, to lash out at me with another round of accusations, or to start sobbing, begging for forgiveness. But none of that happened. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say. I left the room, leaving her alone. My heart was pounding frantically, but I felt strangely calm. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I realized I'd only just begun this journey, but I already felt victorious. I won't let her ruin me further. I won't let her live on my money, enjoy my efforts, when she betrayed me in such a heinous way. When I returned to the kitchen, the lights were off in there. I sat down at the table, opened a bottle of beer, and took a big gulp. In the silence, I could hear Alla wandering around the house. She still didn't seem to believe what had happened. Her footsteps were quiet, careful, as if she was afraid that any sound would disturb this fragile reality I had built for her. Several hours passed. Alla still didn't show up in the kitchen. I was sure she just didn't know how to handle the situation. She was used to me always forgiving. Used to all our fights ending with me backing down. But not this time. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet. I didn't hear Alla, and admittedly, I didn't care where she was. I had already taken all the necessary steps to put an end to our relationship. I had sent the lawyer the paperwork to start divorce proceedings and contacted the bank to block all of her cards. This time I didn't plan to back down. Alla didn't show up in the kitchen as usual. I didn't hear the sound of the TV or the noise of the kitchen dishes. It was strange, because earlier she had at least pretended to be doing something useful, like making coffee or cooking breakfast, despite her constant irritation. Today was different. It was like the whole house was frozen, waiting for something to happen. I walked slowly down the hallway and peeked into the bedroom. She wasn't there. There was no sign of her activity in the hallway either. No baby stuff that she usually had scattered all over the house. The feeling of emptiness was beginning to unsettle me. I felt slightly uneasy, not because I missed her, but because the situation had changed and I wasn't yet sure how to feel about it. As I approached the kitchen, I finally heard her quiet footsteps. Alla was standing at the window with her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. She looked like she'd been up all night, and maybe she had.
No sudden movements, no habitual irritation.
Just silence and cold aloofness. She didn't try to provoke me for the first time in a long time. I made myself some coffee and sat down at the table. We were both silent. There was a tense pause in the air. I knew this conversation would happen sooner or later, but I had no desire to start it now. Let her speak for herself. Let her try to explain her actions. Alla finally broke the silence. Are you really going to leave us? Her voice was quiet, but there was an echo of desperation in it. I looked at her and shrugged. I'm not the one who's leaving. You're the one who ruined everything we had, Alla. She lowered her head, as if she didn't know what to say in response. Her always bright and confident nature was suddenly gone. Before me stood a broken woman, realizing that all her well-being and comfort had collapsed in an instant. But, what will happen to the baby? Her voice trembled. I took another sip of coffee and answered quietly. It is no longer my child. Alla covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. I won't be able to. I don't know how to live without you, she whispered. And you should have thought about that before, I replied coldly. You're on your own now. Those words seemed to break her completely. She sank down in the chair opposite me, her arms wrapped around her head. It was the first time I'd ever seen her like that, completely lost, helpless. This was a person who suddenly realized that her life would never be the same again. She continued to cry, but I was no longer the person to comfort her. Alla herself had destroyed everything we had. Now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. I finished my coffee and left the house, leaving her crying in the kitchen. She had lost everything. When I came home from work the next day, the house was a mess, just as it had been before. Alla had done nothing to remedy the situation, even though she had a whole night and morning to at least tidy it up a little. This only confirmed my fears that she would continue to rely on other people's help without making any effort. I entered the house and saw that she was still sitting in the kitchen where I had left her that morning. Bags and boxes were now scattered around her. She was trying to pack her things, but it was very sloppily done. There was no determination or desire for change in her actions, just panic and indecision. It annoyed me, but I tried to remain calm. How's the packing going? I asked, walking into the kitchen. My tone was neutral, almost indifferent. She flinched and turned toward me, fear in her eyes. I'm trying, she said, her voice shaking. But I don't know where to start. I have no money, no place to live. And what am I going to do with a baby? I leaned back in my chair, watching her. I found it hard to believe that this was the same woman with whom I had once made plans for the future. Her current appearance was a reminder of how much she'd ruined everything. "You already knew the consequences of your actions wouldn't be easy," I said. "Now you're going to see what it means to be in difficult circumstances. I'm not going to solve your problems for you." She was silent, trying to collect her thoughts. I noticed her hands shaking as she packed. Satisfaction was growing inside me that I had brought her to this state. Now she had to face what real life was like without my financial support. Several days had passed since I had announced my decision to Allah. There was an oppressive atmosphere in the house. She didn't try to argue or make a scandal. All she did was quietly pack her things, periodically begging me to reconsider. But I was adamant. All her attempts to appeal to my sympathy had no effect. I shut myself off from her words as from a poison that had long since ceased to affect me. A few more days passed, and Allah not only did not improve her situation, but also got into an even bigger crisis. She couldn't find a place to live because renting apartments required an upfront payment and a steady income, and she had neither. I watched her agony from afar, feeling that all the measures taken had worked. A few more days passed, and not only did Allah's situation not improve, but she found herself in an even bigger crisis. She couldn't find a place to live, because renting an apartment required an advance payment and a steady income, and she had neither. I watched her agony from afar, feeling that all the measures taken had worked. I continued to go to work each morning, but my job no longer seemed so agonizing. I now knew that another step in the process of divorce and further proceedings awaited me at home. I planned to file for divorce as soon as possible, and each trip to the law office brought me closer to finalizing this story. Thoughts often came to me about how much easier it would be if I could just forget everything and start over. But that would have been too easy. Revenge was too sweet to give up halfway through. In those rare moments when she tried to talk to me about the future, her voice trembled and her eyes were full of despair. She realized that all her support was gone. She used to be able to count on me for everything, to know that I would be there for her no matter what she did. Now it was a thing of the past. Allah no longer had the influence over me that she used to have. One night, I heard her talking to her mother on the phone. Her voice was quiet, almost pleading, but even through the closed door I could catch the gist of the conversation. She was asking for help, hoping for support from her family, but it seemed that even there she wasn't welcomed with open arms. Her pride had long prevented her from admitting that something had gone wrong in her perfect life. But now she had to face that truth. Every day Allah looked more and more lost. Her once well-groomed appearance, which she had tried to maintain, began to fade. She was no longer trying to pretend that everything was fine. Now it was just a woman realizing that her comfort and stability was gone. She had lost not only her money, but her sense of control over her own life. One day when I got home, I saw Allah sitting on the couch in the living room. The room was quiet, and I noticed that the baby was sleeping in the other room. Allah looked exhausted, but something in her demeanor had changed. She was no longer crying, but just sitting there as if immersed in her thoughts. Her eyes were tired, but there was no longer the fear I had seen before. "Ivan," she said at last, "I've decided that something has to change. I have nowhere to go, and I don't have any money. I realize you're not going to help me. I'm just asking for some time to get settled on my feet." I stood in front of her, weighing her words. There was no pity or manipulation in her request, just sincerity and a real realization of her situation. This sincerity was a new step in her life, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to change my plans. "I have an opportunity to help you, but on my terms," I said. "I can give you another week. Find a place to live and a job. If you don't, I'll have to file papers with the court to expedite the divorce." She nodded, and there was hope in her gaze. I wasn't going to go back to her or change my mind, but at least temporarily I could give her a chance to right her wrongs. It was the last gesture of kindness I could afford before finally cutting off all ties. One evening I came home later than usual and found Allah in tears in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with her arms around her head. I knew this was the beginning of her total collapse. She was no longer trying to hold herself together, no longer trying to hide her emotions. She realized that all her plans for the future had collapsed, and now she would have to start from scratch. "Ivan, I beg you," she whispered without raising her head, "give me another chance. I'll make it up to you." I realized everything. I looked at her and felt only coldness. She was pleading with me, but I no longer felt pity or love for her. She was no longer the person I had once known. She was now a stranger who had ruined my life by deceit. "Allah," I began calmly, "you've lost everything. You no longer have the right to a second chance." Her face contorted in pain, and I felt her world crumble before my eyes. She couldn't accept that I was no longer her savior, her protector. She would have to learn to live without me, and that was my main punishment. When she finally realized I wasn't going to change my mind, her voice became hard, almost angry. "You'll regret this," she whispered through gritted teeth. But I wasn't afraid of anything anymore. I knew that my path had been chosen, and I would not back down from it. The remaining days passed quickly. Allah really tried to find a place to live and a job, but she was unable to solve all the problems. She continued to show efforts, but these efforts were clearly not enough to change her fate in the short term. With each passing day, I watched her struggle, as she tried to take steps that seemed impossible a few weeks ago. I watched her try to find a job, how she searched for cheap housing, how she finally found a part-time job to survive somehow. When it came time for the final decision, I didn't show the slightest bit of sympathy. I signed all the necessary divorce papers and sent them to the court. These papers were the final step in finally ending this chapter of my life. Several months had passed since the day I kicked Allah out. Time passed, but I never once regretted my decision. She tried to come back several times, calling, texting, but I blocked her number. My revenge wasn't about yelling or violence. It was to show her, her betrayal hadn't gone unnoticed. She had lost everything she had, and now she had to learn to live without my help. Every time I remembered how Allah had tried to manipulate me, I had mixed feelings. It was hard to believe that she could really sink so deeply into deception and lies. I often wondered what might have happened if I hadn't found proof of her cheating. Perhaps I would have continued to live in an illusion, wasting my resources and time on a person who didn't deserve it. I also realized that my revenge was not just an act of retaliation, but a necessary step to rebuilding my own life. It was a liberation not only for me, but for her as well. The change in her status and responsibilities helped her realize what it meant to be independent, and perhaps it was necessary for her own growth. I heard from mutual acquaintances that her new man left her almost as soon as he found out she was without resources. Like a rat, he abandoned a ship that was beginning to sink. Now she was wandering around her relatives, working low-paying part-time jobs, and her former perfect life seemed distant and impossible. And me? I was finally at peace.